Alright, this is video number 2 on the Cold War. If you haven't already done so, go back and watch the video on the Cold War beginnings. That'll give you the background through the late 1940s and how the Cold War got started. This one is going to look at the decade of the 1950s and how the Cold War continued. We'll slow down through some of the important big events of the 50s, but we'll get through that entire decade here. Alright, so one of the things I did not mention in the last video was the creation of the United Nations immediately after World War II. That's going to be important here because they're going to play more of a role in our narrative in the 1950s. But the UN was designed to replace the League of Nations, which had failed miserably at its job of preventing a world war. I'll give you a little bit of background here on the United Nations, how it works. It is made up of something called the General Assembly, which all nations in the world are a part of, or are allowed to be a part of. It's also made up of a Security Council, whose mission is, according to the UN Charter, to maintain peace and security. This Security Council has 15 members on it, but 5 of them are permanent members. Those 5 permanent members are Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States. And what makes these guys important is the Security Council is what talks about military intervention and the use of force. Each one of these 5 members has something called a veto power. So if there is a resolution brought before the Security Council that we need to use force to stop country X from doing something, any one of these 5 countries can veto that resolution, and that is it. It is dead in the water. It's not going anywhere. Because of that, and because the Soviet Union and the United States are on opposite sides during the Cold War, having that veto power is actually going to hurt the United Nations and its ability to do certain things, because one side or the other will veto whatever it is the UN is trying to do. As the Cold War continued in the late 40s, we started setting up our own alliances against each other. The first one is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was created actually in 1949, and it involved the United States, Western Europe, Canada, and what it was a defensive military alliance against potential Soviet invasion. If you remember back to your notes on the League of Nations, Article 10 of the League of Nations said an attack against one is an attack against all. This idea of collective security. Well, here at the end of World War II, we propose another alliance for collective security. But after World War II, Americans will be more willing to embark on one of these than we were after World War I. Now, the Soviet Union, after the creation of NATO, they created something called the Warsaw Pact. It was created several years later, and it involved Eastern Europe, and it was a defensive alliance against NATO. So, if you wanted a definition of the Warsaw Pact, you could just copy that one from NATO, a defensive military alliance between the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for collective security against NATO. And so you had these dueling alliances, and one of the things that happened after the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in 1955 is it led to the creation of something we call the Iron Curtain. The phrase Iron Curtain refers to this geographic separation between East and West. Churchill coined that phrase in a speech that he gave here in the United States, where he talked about how this Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and that geographic separation is going to remain through the rest of the Cold War. Now, one of the early big events of the Cold War is the Korean War. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time here on the Korean War because it was one of these defining moments. Okay? After World War II, Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel, 38 degrees north latitude. In the north was led by a man named Kim Il-sung, and he was supported and aided by the Soviet Union. The south was led by a guy named Syngman Rhee, and he was supported, of course, by the United States. The idea behind dividing Korea was the same with Germany. Korea had been conquered by Japan several years before, and at the end of World War II, the decision is made to split the country into two parts, with the Soviet Union helping one part, the United States helping another part, setting up two governments and doing what they planned on doing in Germany. After the two governments were created, having the people of Korea vote on which government they wanted to fully live under. Much like with what happened in Germany, thousands upon thousands of people from North Korea fled to the south between 1945 and 1950. So again, the communists know that in a free and fair election, they are going to lose, and the country will be unified under that South Korean government. Rather than let that happen, in June of 1950, North Korea launched an invasion of South Korea. And early scholars would say that they were prompted by the Soviet Union. They did have new military equipment from the Soviet Union. They were definitely better equipped and supplied. There has been some recent scholarship that suggests that the North Koreans actually did this on their own, hoping that the Soviet Union would turn around and support them. But whatever, they invaded, and they almost completely took over. You can tell how much of South Korea they took over. This right here became known as the Pusan Perimeter. Seoul is the capital of South Korea, so it's a forward-facing capital. But the South Korean forces were driven all the way back to just the end of the peninsula. Now, the United Nations has as its mission the idea of preventing aggression. And so the United Nations in 1950 is faced with a dilemma. Do they allow North Korea to attack and do nothing, or do they stop? And so a resolution is brought before the Security Council to protect South Korea militarily, and the United Nations votes to do that. They vote to protect South Korea. It's important to note that the Soviet Union, who had a veto power, was actually boycotting the United Nations and refused to go to the meetings. They were boycotting over who is China. The United States had managed to convince the United Nations that that fifth seat, that Chinese seat on the Security Council, should actually be operated by Taiwan and the nationalist government that had actually lost control of mainland China in 1949. And so because of that, the Soviet Union was boycotting. Now, even though the UN officially is going to go in and free South Korea, it's the United States that, of course, is going to provide most of the troops. Because the United States is going to provide most of the troops, the United States would also provide the leader of those military forces. And Truman chose Douglas MacArthur, who had helped lead the campaign in the Pacific against the Japanese, who at that point in time was the military governor of Japan. Truman chose him to lead UN forces in Korea. And MacArthur came up with this grand plan on how the UN forces would counterattack. And in 1950, in September of 1950, the UN forces did counterattack. They invaded behind the lines, just south of the 38th parallel, at a place called Incheon. And at the same time, they also had massed forces, and they pushed out of the Pusan perimeter. And so, while the North Koreans on the front lines are being attacked from Pusan, suddenly they get radio transmissions from behind them saying, we're being attacked back here. And very quickly, the North Korean military retreated back across the 38th parallel by the end of September. And so, South Korea was saved. But of course, the Korean War doesn't end there. In October of 1950, the United Nations kind of trying to decide what to do to punish North Korea, voted to invade North Korea and unify the country under the government of the South. Now again, the Soviet Union was still boycotting, and this is kind of the thing that's going to make them come back to the United Nations, the fact that knowing they could have stopped that had they been there. Now, by November, UN forces were approaching the Yalu River. That's the border between North Korea and China. So the United Nations almost completely took over Korea, the same way North Korea had almost completely taken over the South. And as they approached the Yalu River, the Chinese started warning the United Nations to stay away, that they would consider any actions by the UN within 20 miles of their borders to be aggression. And their fear was, China's fear was, that the United Nations was eliminating one communist country and they were headed toward another communist country. And they were worried that the United Nations might then try to invade China. Okay? And so therefore China invaded on behalf of North Korea and pushed UN forces back into the South, back across the 38th parallel. By the time you got to March of 1951, all that happened in 1950. By the time you got to March of 1951, the fighting on the Korean Peninsula stabilized right around the 38th parallel, and there it would continue for the rest of the war. Now, President Truman and MacArthur had gotten into disagreement. It wasn't just that MacArthur said the war would be over by Christmas, and it wasn't. It had to do with policy and strategy. President Truman believed in something called limited war. Limited war is where you have a war, but you have specific and achievable objectives, and once you achieve your objectives, you negotiate and end the war. So for Truman, freeing South Korea was the specific achievable objective, and that in his mind was where it needed to end. MacArthur had really kind of pushed the issue, and he had pushed the UN, and the UN, believing MacArthur could have it wrapped up, believed that they could take over North Korea. And MacArthur said that they needed to continue to invade. They needed to continue to prosecute the war until North Korea had been conquered, saying at one point, there is no substitute for victory. Now, eventually what's going to happen is MacArthur would criticize Truman and his leadership to the newspapers. And there are certain rules. One of them is you don't criticize your boss. Another one is you don't criticize your boss to the papers, especially if you're in the military. And so Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination. MacArthur was actually invited by Congress, a Republican-controlled Congress, to come and speak to them after he had been fired. And there were calls within Congress after MacArthur spoke to impeach President Truman for firing MacArthur. And there were people that said Truman had no authority to fire MacArthur. Where in the Constitution did it say that the president was in charge of the military? Oh, right here. The president is the commander-in-chief. So, of course, that didn't go anywhere. But eventually, the Korean War would have a ceasefire. And over here on the right, you see the current division between North and South. And you see here's the 38th parallel runs right about here. So there's no real huge changes in territory. That ceasefire continues today. And so that was signed in 1953. The purpose of a ceasefire is to eventually sign a peace treaty. And we're still waiting on that, and it's 2020 now. Now, eventually Truman leaves office, and he'll be replaced by President Eisenhower. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952. There's another video on U.S. politics that covers that. But in terms of the Cold War and foreign policy, Eisenhower and his team came up with what they called the New Look. The New Look for foreign policy. As it applied to the Cold War, it emphasized building up the nation's nuclear weapons and our nuclear stockpiles and our ability to deliver those by plane. We built more bombers. The idea behind building up our nuclear weapons was they wanted to cut the size of the army. The army is very expensive, especially with soldiers having to pay them and feed them and house them every single day. Yes, nuclear weapons are expensive, but you only have the expense once. All you have to have are soldiers to maintain the weapons. And so Eisenhower and his people describe this as the United States having more bang for the buck. Okay? With the same amount of money, or even less money, we could have a bigger deterrent with our nuclear arsenal. New Look also relied on the idea of something called massive retaliation. Yes, the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons also, but no sane country is really going to use those. So the idea behind massive retaliation is we will threaten the Soviet Union that if they do anything, we will retaliate with nuclear weapons. That's what the idea of massive retaliation was. The idea that we can keep them from doing anything aggressive by threatening to nuke them or Moscow or their allies or whoever. It's not necessarily the best way to go. One of the things that will characterize the Cold War that got started in the 50s also is this thing called the space race. Okay? The space race began in October of 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. Sputnik is the first man-made satellite. Sputnik orbited the Earth, and all it did was broadcast a radio signal every so many hours to let the people on the ground know where it was. But it was this huge technological achievement for the Soviet Union, and it led to a crazy amount of fear in the United States. Okay? One of those fears was that the United States was somehow behind the Soviet Union in terms of education. How is it possible that, this country that is supposed to be not nearly as technologically sophisticated as we are was able to launch a satellite into orbit? Okay. And so, to alleviate those fears, the national government started trying to overhaul public schooling, and they started trying to emphasize the instruction of math and science in schools. And this is really when the federal government started to get involved in public schools with this idea that we were behind. In reality, what had happened was at the end of World War II, it was the Germans that were ahead in rocket technology. And most of those German rocket scientists had been in Eastern Germany and were captured by the Soviet Union. And so when they were captured, the Soviet Union forced them, threatened them, convinced them, whatever, to come work for the Soviets and continue their rocket research. In fact, the United States wasn't as behind as people feared. Okay. In this space race that continued, the Soviet Union actually does hold most of the records for, for instance, the first man in space is this guy, Yuri Gagarin. First man in space. He was also the first man to orbit the Earth. He did that all in the same trip. The United States, of course, we have our first American in space, this guy, John Glenn. He was the first American in space, but to be perfectly honest, all he did was go up and back down. He didn't circle the Earth. Okay. But the Soviet Union has records for, the first country to have 2 men in space, the first satellite to orbit the moon. They actually put the first man-made object on the moon by crashing that satellite into the moon. Of course, it'll be the late 60s when the United States, leapfrogged the Soviet Union and claimed the ultimate prize of being able to put a man on the moon. Okay? We're the only country that has been able to do that, and as much as anyone may criticize us for any of the things we do hold some very impressive technological records. Now, as we go through the 50s, other things that go on in the 50s that are going to politically have some more political importance. 1953, Joseph Stalin died. he was replaced by this man, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he's going to be not quite as paranoid and dangerous as Stalin would be, although the Soviet Union would continue its bluster and arguing. Now, also in 1953, the CIA staged a coup in Iran. Now, all these things are important because these things will continue later on in the year as we continue through this course. In Iran, the CIA helped overthrow a popularly elected prime minister who happened to be pro-communist. And when they overthrew him, they helped arrange for the Shah, the emperor of Iran, to get more power. And the Shah in Iran acted and then strengthened his power as a dictator and began oppressing the people, and there were secret police. And you'll need to know that for later. Now, in 1954, the CIA also backed a coup, an overthrow of the government in Guatemala. Again, a pro-communist government had been elected, and the CIA helped overthrow them. This is going to be something the CIA does. It doesn't matter if they're a democracy. It doesn't matter if they got elected. It matters whether or not they're communist or they support us. In 1956, there's something called the Suez Crisis. It involves the Suez Canal. Egypt, which is where the Suez Canal is, Egypt did not own the canal. It had been built in the late 1800s, and it was owned by England and a French company that had built the canal. And in 1956, Egypt took over the canal and said, "This is ours, and we will no longer allow the colonial oppressors, Europe, to use this canal." Also included Israel. Faced with the loss of the canal and the economic implications for shipping stuff to Europe from Asia, now all of a sudden you have to go all the way around Africa, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt. And they invaded the canal area to take it back over. And to, I don't know what their end game was, but to free it from Egyptian control. Now, the United States refused to support that invasion. Britain, France, and Israel were kind of counting on our support in this, and Eisenhower refused to support them. He said, "No, you've actually invaded an independent country. You should have negotiated. You jumped the gun on this." And unfortunately for the Cold War, this actually drove Egypt more toward the Soviet Union in terms of, who's going to be friends. In September of 1959, as we continue rolling through the 50s here, there was an attempt to kind of thaw the Cold War. And meetings had been held on and off through the 50s between the United States and the Soviet Union to try to make things better. And in 1959, it was decided to have an exchange of social interaction and social ideas between the two countries. So in September of 1959, Premier Khrushchev came and visited the United States, and Vice President Richard Nixon played host to Khrushchev and took him around. And there was an exhibition where you would see, here's the modern Soviet household, and over here is the modern United States household. During this tour, Nixon and Khrushchev ended up having what has been called the kitchen debate. As Nixon took him through the model American house, he said, "Look, this is what every mainstream American household has access to. How does this compare to what your people have?" And Khrushchev, of course, was very angered by that because he was trying to portray the Soviet Union as being better than the United States, and it's hard to argue against the idea that everybody in America can have a washer and a dryer and a dishwasher and all these things that they couldn't have in the Soviet Union. And what ended up happening, Nixon when you watch the video on the Red Scare, people already associated him with being an anti-communist. As vice president, he didn't necessarily get a whole lot of public exposure. And this is the year 1959. 1960 will be an election year. And what this kitchen debate did was it helped raise Nixon's political profile in preparation for that 1960 election, where he will be the Republican nominee. Now, in 1960, there was going to be a meeting in Paris between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. That ended up being put off because of something called the U-2 incident. This is a picture of a U-2. It is a spy plane that the United States operated during the Cold War. And for years, the Soviet Union had accused the United States of spying by flying these planes over the Soviet Union. The great thing about these planes is they fly so high in the atmosphere that it was impossible for the Soviet Union to prove that they existed. They could not take pictures of them. They were so high up in the atmosphere. They fly so high up that the pilot actually wears a spacesuit. Now, in 1960, the Soviet Union got lucky, and they were able to shoot one down. They launched a bunch of anti-aircraft missiles up and were able to do enough damage that a U-2 crashed inside the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union went to the United Nations, went to the world with this wreckage and said, see, we have shot down an American spy plane, which of course we denied. And then they produced the pilot. This man named Francis Gary Powers. He's known by his middle name. They produced the pilot, who was alive, and admitted that he was working for the CIA, and he had been spying on the Soviet Union. He had been taking pictures. And the United States was forced to admit to the world that, yes, indeed, we were spying on the Soviet Union, flying these planes, something that we had denied for years. That brings us to 1960. What comes after in terms of foreign policy then will be something for next week and another president. I hope you've enjoyed the early notes on the Cold War.